On the cold streets, a broken man was laughed at, kicked aside, and treated like he was nothing. But one letter changed everything. Overnight, he went from shivering under a bridge to holding the keys to the very house where they once mocked him. What should have been sweet revenge turns into something much darker, because money doesn't erase the scars of humiliation. And when the past comes crawling back, the mansion becomes more than a home. It becomes the stage for betrayal, redemption, and a fight for dignity. They thought he'd stay forgotten. They thought power and wealth were theirs alone. But when the man they mocked now controls their future, will he destroy them, forgive them, or lose himself in the process? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. James trudged through puddles that soaked his worn shoes, each step a reminder of how far he'd fallen. Rain pelted his face, mingling with tears he'd stopped acknowledging months ago. The officer's dismissive wave still burned in his mind, another person treating him like trash to be swept away. The familiar streets of Oakwood Heights came into view. 5 years ago, he'd driven these roads in his modest sedan, grading papers on his porch, waving to neighbors who knew him as Mr. Whitaker, the history teacher. Now those same neighbors crossed to the opposite sidewalk when they spotted him. His body ached from sleeping on concrete. At 58, his joints protested every movement, especially in this dampness. But physical pain paled compared to the hollow ache of loneliness. "Margaret," he whispered, his voice lost in the downpour. His wife's absence still felt like a fresh wound. Cancer had taken her quickly, and with her went their savings, their home, and his will to fight, when the school district pushed him out for younger, cheaper teachers. Lightning flashed, illuminating the grandiose homes lining Maple Avenue. James ducked beneath a sprawling oak tree, its branches offering meager shelter. Across the street stood the Carter mansion, all limestone columns and gleaming windows. Warm light spilled from inside, where shadows moved about in what appeared to be a dinner party. His stomach twisted painfully. When had he last eaten? Yesterday morning? The day before? The soup kitchen downtown only opened 3 days a week. James leaned against the tree trunk, exhaustion overwhelming him. Just 5 minutes of rest, he promised himself. Just enough to gather strength for the long walk to the underpass where he'd stashed his few possessions. Through sheets of rain, he noticed the Carters' front door opening. Several well-dressed figures stepped onto the covered porch, champagne flutes in hand. Their laughter carried across the wet street, carefree and cruel in its carelessness. "Richard, isn't that the homeless man who's been hanging around lately?" A woman's voice, sharp with disgust. "Good God, he's watching the house. Should we call someone?" James flinched, instinctively stepping back, but his foot caught on an exposed root. He stumbled, falling hard onto the muddy ground. The laughter intensified. "Look at him. Probably drunk. That's what happens when you don't plan for the future." James struggled to his feet, shame burning hotter than any fever. These people, his former neighbors, didn't see a man who taught their children, who'd lost everything caring for a dying wife. They saw only dirt and rags. "You don't belong here," Richard Carter called out, voice slurred with expensive whiskey. "This neighborhood is for people who contribute to society." More laughter. Someone mimicked his limping walk. James turned away, hunching his shoulders against words that cut deeper than the cold. He'd been called worthless by teenagers during his teaching days, but never had the word felt so true as it did now, spoken by adults who lived behind warm windows. He shuffled away from the oak tree, each step a small defeat. The rain seemed heavier now, determined to soak through to his bones. His coat, once navy blue, now a faded gray, hung heavy and useless. Tomorrow, he told himself. Tomorrow might be different. The shelter on Kingston Street sometimes had openings on Tuesdays. Maybe there'd be a chance for a shower, clean socks, a real bed. For tonight, there was only the long walk back to the underpass, the company of other forgotten men, and dreams of Margaret's smile that would have to sustain him until dawn. The silver Mercedes pulled into the circular driveway, tires crunching on wet gravel. Through the downpour, James recognized Charles Carter's hulking silhouette behind the wheel. The front door of the mansion swung open, spilling golden light across the manicured lawn. Linda Carter emerged, picture perfect in her designer dress, sheltered beneath an umbrella held by their uniformed housekeeper. "Charles, you're late again. The Hendersons have been waiting for 20 minutes. Her voice carried across the yard, sharp and annoyed. James pressed himself against the iron fence, unable to look away. 2 years ago, Linda had brought him a casserole when Margaret was bedridden. Now, she wouldn't meet his eyes when they passed on the street. The Carters' teenage son, Nathan, bounded down the steps in pressed khakis and a blue blazer. His hair, perfectly styled, reminded James of how he used to help the boy with history homework at their kitchen table. Can we just get this over with? Dad promised I could take the Beamer tonight. Nathan's voice cracked with adolescent impatience. Charles emerged from the car, straightening his tie. One dinner, son. Networking matters in this town. A flash of lightning illuminated James's rain-soaked figure by the fence. Linda gasped. Charles, it's that Whitaker man again. He's just standing there. She clutched her husband's arm. Charles squinted through the rain. James, good God, man, you look terrible. James stepped forward, his throat tight. Charles, I was wondering if what? Money? A job? Charles laughed, the sound brittle in the damp air. You should have planned better. Everyone knew the school was cutting staff. Linda wrinkled her nose. He smells like the gutter. Nathan, go inside. But Nathan lingered, eyes wide with fascination and disgust. Isn't he the teacher who got fired? The one whose wife died? James flinched. I just need somewhere dry tonight. The shelter's full, and that's our problem how? Linda interrupted. Charles, we have guests. Charles sighed theatrically. Look at yourself, James. A pathetic beggar hanging around decent people's homes. What would your students think? What would Margaret think? The mention of his wife's name from these people's lips broke something in James. His knees weakened. Please, he whispered. Nathan snickered, the cruel laughter of youth who hadn't yet learned compassion. He crushed his soda can and tossed it casually. It struck James in the chest, spattering sticky liquid across his already soaked coat. Bullseye, Nathan crowed. Nathan, Charles scolded half-heartedly, but his lips twitched with amusement. Linda's laugh was delicate, practiced. Oh, let him have his fun. Maybe it'll encourage our visitor to find more appropriate surroundings. They turned their backs on him, ascending the steps as a family unit, secure in their fortress of wealth and privilege. James stumbled away, vision blurred by tears he couldn't distinguish from the rain. Each step took monumental effort, his sodden clothes weighing him down like chains. He walked blindly, past darkened shop windows and closed cafes, until his legs gave out behind Dale's grocery. The dumpster provided minimal shelter from the downpour, the stench of rotting produce almost welcome compared to the stink of his own humiliation. James curled into himself, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The ache in his chest had nothing to do with hunger or cold. It was the pain of invisibility, of becoming something less than human in the eyes of people who once respected him. The rain continued to fall, indifferent to his suffering, washing away the sticky soda but not the memory of Nathan's laughter, Charles's contempt, or Linda's disgust. Dawn arrived with cruel brightness. James stirred, his body stiff and aching from a night spent on cold concrete. Every joint protested as he uncurled himself from behind the dumpster. His clothes, still damp from yesterday's downpour, clung to his skin with clammy insistence. A rich, yeasty aroma cut through the alley's usual stench. Warm, inviting. Bread. James blinked, his eyes crusty with sleep and dried tears. A woman stood before him, silver hair tucked beneath a faded blue knit cap, lines etched deeply around kind eyes. She held a thermos in one weathered hand and a paper bag in the other. Thought you might be hungry. Her voice was low and musical, free of the pity he'd grown to despise. James straightened, brushing futilely at his filthy coat. Pride, his last possession, made him want to refuse. But his traitor stomach growled audibly. I'm Grace Miller. I run Hope's Kitchen down on Maple. She didn't wait for his response, simply unscrewed the thermos cap and poured steaming coffee into it. The rich scent made his mouth water. Cream and sugar already added. Most folks like it that way. She handed him the makeshift cup. Heat seeped into his frozen fingers as he took it. Thank you. His voice emerged as a croak, rusty from disuse. Got egg and cheese on sourdough? Made it myself this morning. Grace offered the paper bag without ceremony, as if they were colleagues meeting for breakfast rather than a charitable woman and a homeless man behind a grocery store. James took a cautious sip of coffee. Perfect. Sweet and strong. The first bite of sandwich nearly undid him fresh bread. Real cheese, the simple luxury of warm food. How'd you know I was here? He asked between careful bites, determined to savor every morsel. Grace settled herself on an overturned milk crate. Dale lets me take the day-old bread for the kitchen. Saw you when I came for my pickup. She studied him with clear eyes. You're new to the streets. Not a question. James nodded anyway. Lost my wife, then my job, then the house. Each sentence fell like stones dropped into still water. Funny how fast it all goes. Grace nodded, neither pushing for details nor offering empty sympathies. Life can turn on a dime, that's certain. Been running the kitchen since my Harold passed. 10 years now. James finished the sandwich, fighting the urge to lick crumbs from the wrapper. My grandmother used to say even the lowest valleys can lead to higher mountains. Grace's gaze was direct, her expression serene. The view's worth the climb if you can just keep putting one foot in front of the other. James almost smiled. Your grandmother sounds like an optimist. Realist, Grace corrected. Lived through the Depression, 2 wars, and buried 3 children. Still died smiling. She stood, joints cracking. Kitchen opens at 11 if you want lunch. No sermons, no questions. Just food and maybe some company. Something warm unfurled in James's chest that had nothing to do with coffee. Skepticism warred with desperate hope, the dangerous kind that hurt most when crushed. I might do that, he said softly. Grace nodded once, as if sealing a pact, and walked away. James watched her go, clutching the empty thermos cap. For the first time in months, the day ahead seemed marginally less bleak. James sat on a bench in the small downtown park, watching pigeons squabble over breadcrumbs. After visiting Grace's kitchen for lunch, a bowl of thick vegetable soup and half a turkey sandwich, he'd wandered here to escape the afternoon drizzle. His stomach was full, but the weight of his circumstances still pressed down on him. A shadow fell across the bench. James looked up to find a young man in a charcoal suit standing before him. Rain beaded on the shoulders of his wool coat, and he clutched a leather briefcase to his chest like a shield. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice hesitant. "Are you James Whitaker?" James tensed. In his experience, strangers asking his name rarely brought good news. Bill collectors? Police? He considered lying, but nodded instead. Thank goodness. Relief washed over the young man's face. "I'm Daniel Reeves, legal assistant with Harmon Associates. I've been looking for you for 3 days. He shifted his weight awkwardly. "Would you mind coming with me to our office? It's only 2 blocks from here." James frowned. "What's this about? I'm afraid I can't discuss it here." Daniel glanced around the park. "But it's important. Very important." Curiosity overcame wariness. James stood, wincing as his knees protested. "Lead the way, then." They walked in silence through light rain to a modest brick building. Inside, the law office smelled of leather and paper. A receptionist glanced up, eyes widening slightly at James's appearance, before she schooled her features into professional blankness. "Mr. Harmon is waiting in the conference room," she said. Daniel guided James down a hallway lined with framed diplomas into a small room dominated by a polished oak table. An older man with silver temples rose to greet them. "Mr. Whitaker, William Harmon." His handshake was firm, his eyes assessing but not unkind. "Please sit down." James lowered himself into a leather chair, acutely aware of his unwashed clothes and the days-old stubble on his face. Harmon opened a folder and withdrew a cream-colored envelope. "This is difficult to explain briefly, so I'll be direct. Your cousin, Samuel Whitaker, passed away 2 weeks ago at his ranch in Montana." James blinked. Samuel? The name stirred distant memories, a quiet boy with serious eyes at family reunions decades ago. "I barely knew him. Nevertheless, he knew you." Harmon slid the envelope across the table. "And he made you his sole heir." James stared at the envelope. "That can't be right. We haven't spoken in 43 years, according to our records." Harmon nodded. "Yet his will is quite clear and legally binding." With trembling fingers, James opened the envelope and unfolded the document inside. Legal terminology swam before his eyes until he reached a number that made his breath catch. $850 million, his voice cracked. "That's impossible." Samuel was a very private man, but a remarkably successful one. Cattle ranches, land holdings, investments. Harmon's voice seemed to come from very far away. "As of this morning, it all belongs to you." The room tilted sideways. James gripped the table edge, feeling lightheaded. "Why me?" he whispered. Harmon withdrew a sealed letter from the folder. "He left this for you. Perhaps it explains his reasoning." James took the letter, Samuel's name swimming before his eyes. Yesterday, he'd been invisible, a human shadow. Today, a dead man he barely remembered had made him a millionaire. The world had shifted beneath his feet yet again. Only this time, he wasn't falling. He was rising so fast it left him dizzy with disbelief. The letter trembled in James's hand as he fumbled to open it. The words blurred before his eyes as he tried to comprehend the enormity of what was happening. $850 million, he whispered again, the number too vast to grasp. His heart hammered against his ribs, each beat a thunderclap in his ears. Mr. Harmon leaned forward. "Mr. Whitaker, are you all right? You look rather pale." James opened his mouth to respond, but the room tilted sharply. The ceiling and floor traded places in a nauseating flip. Darkness crowded his vision from the edges inward. and he felt himself sliding sideways. "He's going down," someone shouted. The last thing James felt was hands catching him before everything went black. Cold. Something cold pressed against his forehead. James blinked his eyes open to find himself lying on a leather couch. Daniel knelt beside him, holding a damp cloth to his brow. Mr. Harmon stood nearby, a glass of water in hand. "Welcome back," the lawyer said, offering the glass. "Small sips, please." James struggled to sit up. His head pounded. Did I faint? Yes, quite dramatically. Harmon's expression softened with understanding. Not an uncommon reaction to news of this magnitude. The water was cool against James's parched throat. Memory rushed back Samuel, the will, the impossible sum. "This can't be happening," James murmured. "People like me don't suddenly inherit fortunes. I assure you, Mr. Whitaker, this is very real." Harmon sat beside him. "I've handled Samuel's affairs for 20 years. He was a shrewd businessman who lived simply despite his wealth. The ranches alone are worth over 300 million. James stared at his reflection in the water-glass hollow cheeks, weathered skin, eyes haunted by years of hardship. Why me? Why now? Samuel left no explanation beyond his letter. Harmon gestured to the folded paper that had fallen to the floor. "But his will is ironclad. The paperwork will take several weeks to complete, but you are, as of his passing, an extraordinarily wealthy man." James's hands shook so badly he set the glass down. "I sleep under bridges. I don't even have a change of clothes. That's easily remedied." Harmon consulted his watch. "Daniel will take you to the Grand Metropolitan. We've arranged a suite for you while we process the inheritance. The hotel will provide whatever you require: meals, clothing, toiletries." 2 hours later, James stood alone in a hotel suite larger than the classroom where he'd once taught. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a panoramic view of the city. Somewhere out there was the bridge he'd slept under last night. He ran his fingers over the crisp white bedding, a real bed, with real pillows. The bathroom gleamed with marble and chrome. Hot water flowed at the turn of a tap. Wrapped in a plush hotel bathrobe after his first proper shower in years, James finally opened Samuel's letter. The handwriting was neat but shaky, written in the final days of an old man's life. "James," it began simply, "you won't remember, but when I was 10 and you were 12, you stood up for me when others wouldn't. Small kindnesses leave the deepest marks. Live well, cousin." James sank onto the bed, letter clutched to his chest. Outside, darkness fell over the city. He lay back against the pillows, too overwhelmed to cry, too stunned to sleep, watching the ceiling as if it might disappear and reveal this all as a dream. His fortune had changed. But he still couldn't believe it. James woke with a start, momentarily disoriented by the softness beneath him. No hard ground, no damp cardboard, just clean, crisp sheets that smelled like sunshine. He ran his palm over the cotton, marveling at its smoothness against his skin. For a moment, he lay perfectly still, afraid any movement might shatter this dream. Sunlight streamed through a gap in the heavy curtains, painting a golden stripe across the carpet. He watched dust motes dance in the beam, remembering all the mornings he'd woken to the harsh glare of streetlights, or the prodding of a police officer's baton. "It's real," he whispered to himself. "It's actually real." He swung his legs over the side of the bed, toes sinking into plush carpet. The simple pleasure nearly brought tears to his eyes. In the bathroom, he stood under the shower for what felt like hours, adjusting the temperature just because he could. Hot water cascaded over his shoulders, washing away years of grime that no gas station sink could touch. Clean and dressed in the clothes the hotel had provided, slacks and a button-down shirt that actually fit, James ventured downstairs. The breakfast buffet stretched before him like a mirage. Silver chafing dishes steamed with eggs, bacon, sausages. Baskets overflowed with pastries. Fresh fruit glistened under spotlights. His stomach clenched painfully, remembering yesterday's hunger. "Help yourself, sir," a server said, placing a cup of coffee before him. James filled his plate carefully, fighting the urge to pile it high, to hoard food in his pockets as he'd done at soup kitchens. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, occasionally catching his reflection in the polished silverware, a stranger looking back at him. After breakfast, he returned to his suite and found the phone. His fingers hovered over the buttons before dialing the soup kitchen's number from memory. "St. Michael's Kitchen," a familiar voice answered. "Grace," he said, his voice catching. "It's James. James Whitaker." "James, thank heavens. I was worried when you didn't come in for breakfast. Are you all right?" He sank into an armchair, suddenly overwhelmed. "I don't know how to explain this. My life has changed overnight. I'm at the Grand Metropolitan Hotel." "The Grand? How on earth?" A distant cousin died, left me money. A lot of money. James swallowed hard, more than I can wrap my head around. Silence hung between them. Then Grace's gentle laugh warmed the line. Well, the Lord works in mysterious ways, doesn't he? I wanted to thank you for the sandwich yesterday, for always being kind when others weren't. Oh, James, she sighed. A sandwich is just a sandwich, not to someone who's starving. The silence returned, comfortable this time. Don't let it change your heart, Grace finally said. Money has a way of hardening people. Remember what it felt like to be invisible. James glanced around the luxurious suite, then down at his clean hands with trimmed nails. I don't think I could forget if I tried. Good, she said firmly. That's your gift now. You know both sides of the street. After hanging up, James stood at the window overlooking the city. Somewhere down there, people still huddled in doorways and behind dumpsters. Yesterday, he'd been one of them. Today, he stood above it all, separated by glass and circumstance. Grace was right. The money was changing everything around him. He couldn't let it change what was inside him. 2 days later, James sat across from Mr. Peterson, the estate lawyer, in a wood-paneled office downtown. Folders and documents covered the polished conference table between them. As you can see, Mr. Whitaker, your cousin Samuel's holdings were substantial. Peterson adjusted his glasses and slid another folder forward. These are the real estate properties. Ranches in Montana and Wyoming, apartments in New York, beachfront property in Florida. James nodded numbly, still struggling to comprehend the figures before him. Each page represented more money than he'd ever imagined possessing. There's one property that might interest you particularly. Peterson's voice took on an unusual tone. It's not part of the estate, but it's recently come to market. He slid a glossy real estate listing across the table. James's heart stopped when he saw the address, the Carter Mansion, the very place where he'd stood shivering in the rain just days ago. The Carters are in foreclosure? James whispered. Peterson nodded. Apparently, their finances weren't quite what they projected. The bank is moving quickly. They're being evicted today, in fact. James stared at the photo of the massive colonial with its perfect lawn and circular driveway. He remembered Charles Carter's mocking laughter, Linda's disgusted expression, their son's casual cruelty as the soda struck his shoulder. I'd like to drive by, James said suddenly. An hour later, James sat in a rental car across from the mansion. Moving trucks lined the driveway. Men carried furniture and boxes down the grand steps. On the lawn, a harried Linda Carter directed the placement of items while Charles argued with someone who looked like a bank representative. Their teenage son sat on a garden wall, scowling at his phone, oblivious to the activity around him. Something shifted in James's chest. Not satisfaction at their downfall, but a strange, almost unsettling sense of possibility. Take me back to the lawyer's office, he told the driver. By sunset, the papers were signed. James Whitaker was now the owner of the Carter Mansion, having paid cash several million above the asking price to expedite the process. As twilight deepened, James stood on the sidewalk where he'd once been mocked. The moving trucks were gone. Only the Carters remained, their faces gray with exhaustion and humiliation. A single luxury car was being loaded with their personal items. James approached slowly, the deed in his hand. Charles Carter noticed him first, his expression shifting from confusion to recognition to disbelief. You? He sputtered. Hello, Mr. Carter, James said quietly. What are you doing here? Linda's voice was sharp with disdain, though her eyes betrayed confusion at his transformed appearance. I've purchased your home. James held up the deed. The paperwork is complete. Charles's face flushed deep red. This is absurd. You were homeless. Yes, James nodded. I was. The teenage son looked up from his phone, finally registering what was happening. His mouth fell open. How could you possibly afford? Linda began. Life changes quickly, James interrupted. Sometimes overnight, sometimes with a soda thrown at a hungry man. The three Carters stared at him, recognition and shame dawning on their faces. You have until morning to collect your remaining belongings, James said, turning to leave. He paused, looking back at the family whose mockery had once cut him so deeply. I know what it's like to have nowhere to go. I wouldn't wish it on anyone. He walked away, the deed clutched in his hand, feeling neither triumph nor revenge, only the strange weight of a circle completed. James walked through the cavernous, empty rooms of the mansion, his footsteps echoing against marble floors and high ceilings. Chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls of crystal, catching the last light of day through tall windows. This palace of wealth, his palace, now felt both magnificent and hollow. He trailed his fingers along an ornate fireplace mantel. 24 hours ago, he'd slept behind a dumpster. Now, he owned one of the most prestigious homes in the city. The whiplash of fortune left him dizzy. "I showed them," he whispered to the empty room. But the words fell flat, bringing none of the satisfaction he'd imagined. The moment when the Carters realized who had purchased their home should have felt triumphant. Instead, it had left him with a strange emptiness. James wandered into what must have been the formal dining room. He pictured the Carters dining here, laughing and talking, while he'd been outside in the rain. The contrast burned in his chest not with anger now, but with something more complicated. He found himself climbing the sweeping staircase to the second floor. The master bedroom suite was larger than his former apartment. Standing before the wall of windows overlooking the manicured grounds, James caught sight of his reflection. Clean-shaven now, wearing new clothes, he hardly recognized himself. But his eyes, they remained the same. Tired, searching, unsure. "Is this what you wanted?" he asked his reflection. Wealth had changed everything and nothing. The hunger and cold were gone, but the wounds of loss remained. His beloved wife Sarah was still gone. The years of struggle and humiliation couldn't be erased by a bank account. James pressed his palm against the cool glass, looking out at the darkness beyond. Stars winked above the tree line. Somewhere out there, the Carters were figuring out their next move. Somewhere, others like him were huddling in doorways and under bridges, invisible to the world that rushed past. His inheritance had given him power he never expected to have. But power to do what? James turned from the window and sat on the edge of the massive empty bed frame. The Carter family had taken their mattress, their furniture, their lives, but left behind the shell that had housed their prosperity. "What would you do, Sarah?" he whispered, thinking of his late wife's boundless compassion. She had been the one who invited neighborhood children in for cookies, who organized coat drives in winter, who saw worth in everyone. She would know how to fill this emptiness with something meaningful. The answer wasn't in revenge. The brief satisfaction of the Carters' shocked faces had already faded, leaving nothing of substance behind. The true question loomed before him, impossible to ignore in these empty rooms. What should he do with his fortune? What purpose could possibly match the magnitude of what he'd been given? James stood and walked back to the window. The night had deepened, the stars brighter now. He placed his hand against the glass again, feeling the boundary between his new shelter and the cold world, outside a world he understood all too well. "This is just the beginning," he said quietly to the darkness. "Just the beginning." The moving truck arrived before 9, though James had little to unload. A suitcase of new clothes, toiletries from the hotel, and a small cardboard box containing his only surviving possessions from before a dog-eared photo of Sarah, her wedding ring, and a fountain pen she'd given him on their 10th anniversary. "Where would you like these items, Mr. Whitaker?" asked a nervous housekeeper, a middle-aged woman who'd worked for the Carters for years. James glanced at her name tag. "Please call me James Maria." Maria's eyes widened slightly. "Yes, sir, James." The staff moved around him with careful politeness, stealing glances when they thought he wasn't looking. James caught whispers. In corners they knew he'd been homeless. He could read the questions in their expressions. Was he mentally stable? Would he be cruel? Would their jobs last? He wandered through the West Wing alone, running his hand along mahogany banisters and marble countertops. The kitchen gleamed with stainless steel and granite, large enough to feed 50. He paused at a window overlooking the back garden, remembering how he'd once pressed his face to this very glass from the outside, watching the Carters host a Christmas party. "I stood right here," he murmured, "in the rain." A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Grace stood in the doorway, a covered dish in her hands, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. "Thought you might need something homemade in this fancy palace." James smiled his first genuine smile in days. "How did you find me?" "Your lawyer told me. Hope that's all right." She set the dish on the counter and looked around, whistling low. "My goodness, James. It's something else. It doesn't feel real." Grace studied his face carefully. "You're standing in the same spot, aren't you, where they saw you that night?" James nodded, unable to hide his surprise at her perception. She took his arm firmly and led him away from the window. "Don't plant yourself in that moment, James. That rain is over. It's hard not to think about it. Of course it is. But dwelling there won't heal anything." Grace lifted the foil off her dish, releasing the aroma of homemade apple cobbler. "You need to look forward, not backward." James leaned against the counter, suddenly tired. "I don't know how to be rich, Grace. I was a teacher, then I was homeless. What am I supposed to do with all this?" Grace cut a slice of cobbler and handed it to him on a plate she pulled from a cabinet. "Same thing you did when you had nothing. Be decent, just with more resources. I want to help people. People like me who lost everything. That's a good start." James took a bite of the cobbler, the sweetness and cinnamon warming him from inside. Will you help me? I don't want to lose myself in all this. Grace's eyes crinkled with her smile. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd ask. I need to do something good with this money, something that matters. You will. She patted his hand. But first, finish your cobbler and show me around this ridiculous house. I want to see if those bathrooms are as big as they say. James laughed, feeling lighter than he had in years. The mansion's emptiness seemed less daunting with Grace there, and for the first time he began to see not what the house had been, but what it could become. 3 days after moving in, James parked his newly purchased sedan outside Grace's soup kitchen. The building's faded sign hung crooked above a door with peeling paint. Inside, the scent of vegetable soup and fresh bread filled the cramped space where 24 people huddled at mismatched tables. James recognized several faces from his own days on the streets. They looked up when he entered, a few with suspicion, others with surprise. "Is that you, Mr. Whitaker?" called out a bearded man in a patched jacket. "Heard you hit the lottery or something." James shook his head. "Not the lottery, Raymond. But yes, my situation has changed." Grace emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a stained apron. Her eyes brightened at the sight of James. "Well, look who decided to join us again." She gave him a quick hug. "You here for lunch or something else?" James glanced around at the worn-out space. A ceiling tile sagged dangerously, and the industrial refrigerator hummed and rattled. "I need to speak with you privately." In Grace's tiny office, James pulled out his checkbook. "How much does this place need to run properly for a year?" Grace's eyebrows shot up. "James, we get by. Getting by isn't enough. How much to fix the roof, replace the equipment, stock the pantry, and pay decent wages to your volunteers?" Grace stared at him, then slowly wrote a figure on a scrap of paper. James added a 0 and wrote the check. "This is too much," she whispered, her hands trembling as she held the check. "No, it's exactly right." James stood. "And I want to hire some of your regulars, men who need work and have skills." The next morning, 5 men arrived at the mansion's gates. They shuffled nervously, carrying worn tool belts and decades of experience as carpenters, electricians, and painter skills unused since they'd lost their homes. "I have 3 wings that need complete renovation," James explained, leading them through the enormous house. "You'll be paid fair wages, with meals and transportation provided." A tall veteran named Marcus spoke up. "Why us? You could hire professionals." James stopped walking. "Because I sat beside you at Grace's kitchen last winter. You shared your coffee with me when I couldn't stop shaking from the cold." He looked at each man. "I know what it's like when people look through you instead of at you." The men began work that day. James worked alongside them, his muscles remembering the satisfaction of physical labor. By week's end, the team had grown to 15, including women who had once been nurses, teachers, and office managers, before foreclosures or medical bills had taken everything. One evening, James overheard Marcus talking to a younger man who joined the crew. "Before this, I thought I was finished. Nothing left to give anyone." Marcus adjusted a level against a freshly hung door. "Mr. Whitaker didn't just give me a job, he gave me back my name." James slipped away unnoticed, a warmth spreading through his chest that no amount of wealth could create. That night, he sketched plans at his desk until dawn designs for more renovations, more jobs, more opportunities to help. For the first time since inheriting his fortune, the mansion felt less like a symbol of revenge and more like the beginning of something meaningful. The money itself meant nothing but what it could do. The dignity it could restore was everything. James sat at the head of a polished conference table, surrounded by men and women in expensive suits. The financial advisors and lawyers exchanged glances as he outlined his plans. "I want half the estate converted into a foundation," James explained, his voice steady, despite the nervous flutter in his stomach. "Dedicated to helping the homeless transition back to independence." A balding advisor cleared his throat. "Mr. Whitaker, while philanthropy is admirable, we typically recommend clients maintain at least 90% of their wealth in growth investments." James leaned forward. "I lived under a bridge for 3 years. I know what's needed more than any investment strategy could tell me." The room fell silent. "Forgive me, Mr. Whitaker," said a younger lawyer, adjusting her glasses. "Your compassion is commendable. Perhaps we could structure something that balances growth with your humanitarian goals." By afternoon's end, James had established the Whitaker Foundation with $400 million. The remaining fortune would generate ongoing funding for decades to come. As the experts gathered their papers, several approached with newfound respect in their eyes. "My brother was homeless after his divorce," confided one attorney quietly. "No one would hire him. If someone had given him the chance you're giving others." 2 days later, James stood before a boarded-up department store downtown. Pigeons roosted in broken windows, and graffiti covered the brick facade. But James saw potential where others saw decay. "This is it," he told Marcus and the crew who had gathered behind him. 3 floors, solid structure, enough space for dormitories, a kitchen, classrooms, and medical facilities. Marcus kicked at a discarded bottle. "People been trying to get the city to do something with this eyesore for years." James handed him a set of keys. "Now we will." The transformation began immediately. The crew from the mansion doubled, then tripled as word spread. Veterans who'd slept in parks now installed plumbing. Women who'd huddled in shelters designed living spaces with privacy and dignity in mind. Former accountants who'd lost everything in the recession managed budgets and supply orders. One afternoon, James found Daryl, a former construction foreman who'd been homeless after a workplace injury, studying blueprints with intense concentration. "Something wrong with the plans?" James asked. Daryl pointed to a section of the building. "We could reconfigure this area, create 10 more beds without sacrificing common space." "Do it," James said simply. Daryl looked up, surprise crossing his weathered face. "Just like that? You trust my judgment?" "More than I trust my own on construction matters." The man's eyes glistened. "Been a long time since anyone valued my opinion." As weeks passed, the building took shape, and so did the community around it. They shared lunches on makeshift tables, swapped stories, and solved problems together. When city inspectors created obstacles, the team navigated bureaucracy with determination. When supplies ran late, they improvised solutions. One evening, as sunset painted the renovated windows gold, James watched his crew, his people, sharing pizza and laughing over the day's challenges. A woman who'd once been a nurse was teaching a younger man how to bandage a cut. 2 veterans argued good-naturedly about the best way to secure a doorframe. For the first time since losing his wife, James felt the warm current of belonging flow through him. These weren't just employees. This wasn't charity. This was family found in the most unexpected place, born from shared wounds and common purpose. The emptiness that had hollowed his heart began to fill, not with money or revenge, but with something far more valuable: connection. The mansion's enormous kitchen gleamed under soft lights as midnight approached. James set 2 steaming mugs of chamomile tea on the island counter where Grace sat, her silver hair catching the light. "You didn't have to wait up for me," he said, sliding onto the stool beside her. Grace wrapped her hands around the warm mug. "I wanted to hear how the shelter inspection went." "We passed. Every code, every requirement." James couldn't keep the pride from his voice. "We open next Monday." "That's wonderful." Her smile crinkled the corners of her eyes. Samuel's money couldn't have gone to better hands. They fell into comfortable silence, a rhythm they'd developed over the past weeks. Grace had started visiting the mansion to help organize donation drives, but somehow these late-night talks had become their ritual, just the 2 of them, in the quiet hours when the world slept. "I've been meaning to ask," James said carefully. "The soup kitchen takes so much of your time. Don't you ever want to rest?" Grace looked down at her tea. "After Robert died, rest was all I had. Too much of it." "Robert was your husband?" She nodded, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. 32 years together. Pancreatic cancer took him in 6 months. James felt a familiar ache. "I'm sorry." "The night he died," Grace continued, her voice softening, "I sat in our garden until sunrise, screaming at God, screaming at the universe. I'd spent my life believing in something greater, and then—" Her voice caught. Then everything that mattered was gone. The kitchen felt suddenly sacred, a confessional of shared grief. James resisted the urge to reach for her hand. "What changed?" he asked. "Nothing at first. I went through the motions. Then one morning I was walking past the community center. A woman was trying to unload food donations alone, dropping cans, crying in frustration. Grace looked up, meeting his eyes. I helped her carry everything inside. She hugged me so tight I could hardly breathe. That night I slept without nightmares for the first time in months." James understood completely. Helping others helps ourselves. "It saved me," Grace admitted. "The soup kitchen became my second chance. My way back to faith, not in some grand divine plan, but in simple human kindness." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating her face for a moment. Thunder followed seconds later. "What about you?" she asked. "Do you believe in anything after everything you've been through?" James considered the question. "I believe in people. Some will mock you when you're down. Others will find you behind a dumpster and offer coffee and a sandwich." Grace laughed softly, the sound warming the kitchen more than any tea could. "I'm grateful I found you that morning," she said. "So am I." Their eyes held for a moment longer than usual. James felt something shift between them, subtle as a change in barometric pressure before a storm. Grace glanced at the clock and stood. "It's late. I should go." As he walked her to the door, James realized with sudden clarity that this enormous mansion felt empty whenever she left. For all his new wealth and purpose, Grace had become his true north, steady, unwavering, genuine. Standing at the threshold, watching her headlights disappear down the long driveway, James acknowledged the truth he'd been avoiding. Grace Miller had become far more than a friend. She was the anchor that kept him from drifting into bitterness or pride, and that terrified him more than any night he'd ever spent homeless. James couldn't sleep that night. He wandered through the empty hallways of the mansion, his footsteps echoing across marble floors. The grandeur that had once represented everything he'd lost now felt hollow, without purpose. He paused in the massive ballroom, moonlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. Crystal chandeliers hung silent above the polished dance floor, where the Carters had once hosted lavish parties for the city's elite. James remembered watching from outside, invisible. The idea struck him with such clarity that he actually spoke aloud. "This place was never meant for me." But not in defeat and revelation. By morning, he'd filled 3 pages with notes. When Grace arrived to help with donation sorting, he practically pulled her through the door. "I want to host a gala," he announced, eyes bright with excitement. Grace raised an eyebrow. "A gala? For investors?" "No." James spread his notes across the kitchen counter. "For people who've never been invited to one. People who've been told they don't belong in beautiful places." Understanding dawned on Grace's face. The homeless. And veterans. Single parents from the shelters. Everyone who society makes invisible. His words tumbled out faster. "Imagine walking into this ballroom, not as someone to be pitied or feared, but as an honored guest." Grace's eyes glistened. "When?" 3 weeks from Saturday. We'll need help, lots of it." The mansion transformed into a command center. James converted one wing into a temporary tailor shop, bringing in seamstresses who measured shelter residents for donated formal wear. 3 local dry cleaners offered to clean and press everything at no charge. "Too tight across the shoulders?" asked a tailor, adjusting pins on Marcus, a veteran who'd been sleeping under the highway overpass until James hired him for mansion renovations. Marcus stood straighter, staring at his reflection. "Never worn anything this fine, sir." "You look distinguished," James said, meaning it. In the ballroom, volunteers taught basic dance steps to shelter residents. James watched as a young woman named Tanya, who'd fled domestic violence with her daughter, tentatively followed the waltz count. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, she whispered, eyes fixed on her feet. "You're a natural," her instructor encouraged. Tanya's daughter clapped from the sidelines. "Mommy looks like a princess." In the kitchen, former restaurant workers created sample menus, arguing good-naturedly about which dishes would impress without intimidating guests who'd been eating at soup kitchens. "Everyone deserves to know what truffle tastes like," insisted Carlos, who'd been a sous chef before alcoholism cost him everything. "And everyone deserves real silverware, not plastic," added Denise, who'd once managed a catering company before medical bills bankrupted her. James stood in the doorway, watching them work with purpose and pride. These were people society had discarded, now planning a celebration of their own worth. One evening, James found Grace addressing invitations at the dining room table. "You're changing lives," she said without looking up. "I'm just giving back what I was given." James sat beside her, a chance to remember who they really are. The RSVPs began arriving, hesitant yeses, notes of disbelief, grateful acceptances. Many had never received a formal invitation to anything. As the mansion buzzed with preparations, workers sang while hanging decorations. Laughter echoed through halls that had known only hollow wealth. James realized he wasn't just planning a party. He was building a night where dignity wasn't earned or bought, but freely given. The mansion finally had a purpose worthy of its grandeur. The night of the gala arrived with perfect spring weather, stars sprinkled across a velvet sky. James stood at the entrance of the mansion, heart hammering in his chest as the first guests began to arrive. Marcus stepped out of the first car, resplendent in a tailored navy suit. Gone was the hunched posture of a man who slept under bridges. He stood tall, shoulders back, extending his arm to his wife, who'd left him during his darkest days but had agreed to come tonight. "Welcome," James said, shaking his hand. "You look like you were born for that suit." Marcus blinked rapidly. "Never thought I'd set foot in a place like this, Mr. Whitaker. Not as a guest, anyway." More cars arrived, borrowed, donated, or hired for the evening. Women in elegant gowns, men in suits, children wide-eyed in their first formal wear. Each face held the same mixture of disbelief and wonder. Inside, the ballroom glowed golden. Crystal chandeliers caught and multiplied the light, casting rainbow reflections across the dance floor. Tables draped in white linen held real silver, fine china, and centerpieces of fresh spring flowers. Tanya entered with her daughter, both in matching blue dresses. "Is this real?" she whispered to James. "Very real," he answered, "and very deserved." Carlos supervised an army of volunteer servers, many of whom had been guests at soup kitchens only months before. They glided between tables with trays of delicacies, tiny pastries filled with wild mushrooms, seared scallops, tender medallions of beef. An elderly woman who'd been living in her car for 3 years after losing her home sank into her chair with a sigh. "I'd forgotten what proper food tastes like," she said, closing her eyes as she savored a bite. The orchestra began to play, and couples tentatively moved to the dance floor. Their practiced steps came back to them, gaining confidence with each measure. Laughter broke out when someone missed a step, but it was warm laughter, shared rather than mocking. Grace appeared at James's side, stunning in a simple emerald dress. "Look at them," she said, voice thick with emotion. He saw what she meant. It wasn't just fine clothes and good food transforming these people. It was the way they stood straighter, smiled more easily, looked each other in the eye. For one night, they weren't defined by what they lacked. Midway through the evening, James clinked his glass. The room fell silent as he stepped onto the small platform where the orchestra sat. "I once stood outside this very mansion," he began, "cold and hungry, watching the fortunate ones through these windows." His voice wavered. "That night, I was mocked for wanting to belong." He surveyed the room, meeting the eyes of those who knew exactly how that felt. Second chances aren't just about money or luck. They're about seeing each other's humanity even when society looks away. Everyone in this room has known darkness. Yet here you stand, in your finest clothes, showing the world what I've always known. Dignity isn't something we earn. It's something we're born with. Tears streamed down Grace's cheeks as she watched the crowd hang on James's every word. The mansion that once represented everything painful about wealth and exclusion now radiated warmth and welcome. To second chances, James raised his glass. To second chances, the room echoed back, glasses glinting in the chandelier light. James hummed as he descended the staircase the morning after the gala, still wrapped in the warmth of last night's success. Sunlight streamed through the windows, catching dust motes dancing in the air. The mansion staff moved quietly, cleaning up the remnants of celebration. "Coffee, sir?" asked Elijah, a former veteran James had hired as household manager. "Please, and whatever breakfast Carlos has prepared. I'm famished after." The doorbell rang, shrill and insistent. Then again, and again. Elijah frowned. "I'll see who's so impatient." He returned moments later, face ashen. "Sir, there are reporters. Dozens of them. At the gates, on the street." James followed him to the front window and pulled back the curtain. His stomach dropped. A sea of cameras, microphones, and shouting faces pressed against the iron gates. Signs waved above heads. Vans with satellite dishes lined the street. "What on earth?" Carlos burst through the door holding a newspaper, his face grim. "You need to see this." The headline screamed in bold black letters, "Fraud billionaire, ex-homeless man stole fortune." Below it, a grainy photo showed James at his lowest point, unshaven, dirty, slumped against a wall. The caption read, "Whitaker's drug fueled past. Sources reveal pattern of lies and manipulation." James sank into the nearest chair, newspaper trembling in his hands. The article claimed he'd manipulated his elderly cousin into changing his will, suggesting blackmail and even elder abuse. It quoted anonymous sources describing James as a con artist with a history of addiction who'd faked homelessness to gain sympathy. "It's all lies," he whispered. His phone rang his lawyer. "James, have you seen the news? We have a serious situation. The inheritance challenge has already been filed." "Challenge by whom?" "Distant relatives of Samuel claiming undue influence. And that's just the beginning. 3 charities have already called to distance themselves from your foundation. The Downtown Shelter Project investors are pulling out." The doorbell rang again. This time, Elijah returned with an official-looking envelope. "Delivered by courier," marked urgent. James's hands shook as he tore it open. The bank was freezing his accounts pending investigation. "Turn on the television," Carlos said quietly. The morning news showed reporters clustered outside the mansion. Sources close to the Whitaker estate suggest the so-called rags-to-riches story may be an elaborate fraud, the anchor announced. Former associates described James Whitaker as a manipulative drifter with substance abuse issues who targeted a wealthy, vulnerable relative. The screen flashed more photos: James sleeping on a park bench, James in line at the soup kitchen, James accepting spare change from a passerby. Each image, once representing his suffering, now twisted into evidence of supposed deception. His phone buzzed constantly with calls from panicked partners and frightened collaborators. One by one, they abandoned him. "They're saying the gala was just for show," Elijah said, looking at his own phone. "That you were buying goodwill to cover your tracks." James stared out the window at the reporters clamoring for his downfall. Just 24 hours ago, the mansion had been filled with hope and second chances. Now it felt like a gilded cage. "Sir?" Carlos asked, concern etching his weathered face. But James couldn't answer. The familiar weight of rejection crushed his chest, heavier than it had ever been on the streets. Society had turned its back on him once again, this time with cameras rolling to capture his fall. 3 days passed like a funeral procession. James hadn't left his bedroom since the headlines broke. Untouched trays of food collected outside his door. The grand mansion, once vibrant with possibility, now echoed with emptiness. Sunlight tried to push through the drawn curtains, but James preferred the darkness. He sat in an armchair facing the window, still wearing the same clothes from that morning when everything collapsed. His phone lay silent on the nightstand. He'd stopped checking the endless stream of cancellations, accusations, and abandonments. A soft knock broke the silence. "Leave it," he called, assuming it was another meal he wouldn't touch. "James?" Grace's voice carried through the door. "It's me." He didn't answer, but heard the door open anyway. Her footsteps crossed the room, hesitant at first, then determined. "You need to open these curtains," she said, reaching for the heavy fabric. "Don't." His voice cracked from disuse. Grace paused, then turned to face him instead. The dim light revealed his unshaven face, the dark circles under his eyes, the slump of his shoulders. "You haven't been eating?" James stared at the floor. "Not hungry." She sat on the ottoman facing him, leaning forward to catch his downcast eyes. "The staff is worried sick about you. Carlos made your favorite soup yesterday. Elijah's been keeping the reporters away." "Why bother?" James whispered. "Let them come. Let them see what they've done. Is that what you want? To prove them right? That you're defeated?" He finally looked at her, eyes hollow. "It doesn't matter what I do. I was mocked when I had nothing. Now I'm mocked with millions. It's like I'm cursed, Grace. Maybe some people are just born to be laughed at." Grace reached for his hand. He didn't pull away, but his fingers remained limp in hers. "James, this isn't you talking. This is exhaustion and hurt. No, this is clarity." He gestured vaguely at the mansion around them. "All this, it was just a cruel joke. The universe letting me climb up just to watch me fall harder. The James I know wouldn't talk this way. The James you knew was a fool." His voice hardened slightly. "Building shelters, hiring people, hosting galas, thinking I could make a difference. Who was I kidding? A homeless man doesn't get to become a savior." Grace's grip tightened. "Stop it, right now. Why fight it anymore? The investors are gone. The charities want nothing to do with me. Even the shelter project is dead." He looked away. "Maybe I should just give up. Let the lawyers have it all. Go back to the streets where I belong." "You don't believe that." "Don't I?" His voice broke. "Look at me, Grace. Really look. I'm the same pathetic man who slept behind dumpsters. Money didn't change that. Nothing can." Grace stood abruptly, her eyes flashing with something James hadn't seen before: anger. "The man I met behind that grocery store had nothing but still shared his last apple with a stray dog. That man walked 3 miles to help an elderly woman carry her groceries home. That man told stories to homeless children to help them forget their hunger." She pointed at him. "That man had dignity when the world offered him none. Where is he?" James turned away. "He died, crushed under headlines and lies." Grace's shoulders fell. She walked to the door, then paused. "When you find him again, the real James, let me know. Because that's the man worth fighting for." The door closed softly behind her, leaving James alone in the shadows once more. The next morning, Grace returned with reinforcements. She walked straight to the curtains and yanked them open, flooding the room with harsh sunlight. James winced, shielding his eyes. "Enough darkness," she declared. He turned away. "Please leave." "Not happening." Grace placed a tray beside him: coffee, toast, and a small vase with a single daisy. "You'll eat, you'll shower, and then we're going downstairs." "What for?" His voice was flat, defeated. Grace sat across from him, her expression softening but determined. "James, look at me." When he finally met her gaze, she leaned forward. Do you remember Tom, the Vietnam veteran who couldn't find work for 15 years because of his PTSD? James said nothing. Tom's supervising the East Wing renovation now. He told me yesterday he's sleeping through the night for the first time since 1975. Grace reached for James's hand. And Maria, the single mother you hired as your housekeeper? Her daughter just got accepted to college, first in their family. Something flickered across James's face, a crack in the wall of despair. And what about the Reynolds family? They were living in their car when you found them. Now they're managing the downtown property. Grace's voice grew more passionate. They named their new baby James, for heaven's sake. James swallowed hard. That doesn't change what people are saying. People who don't know you. Grace squeezed his hand. The ones who do are downstairs right now. What? 23 people you've helped are in your living room. Not because you're rich, James. Because you saw them when no one else would. James's eyes glistened. I can't face them. Not like this. That's exactly why you must. Grace stood, pulling him up gently. Wealth doesn't define you. Your heart does. It always has, even when you had nothing. James hesitated, then allowed himself to be led to the bathroom. He showered quickly, shaved, and put on fresh clothes. Each movement felt mechanical, but by the time he finished, something had shifted inside him, a tiny flame of resilience reigniting. At the top of the grand staircase, he froze. Voices drifted up from below, low conversations, even occasional laughter. Grace waited patiently beside him. What if they're disappointed in me, he whispered, hiding up here like a coward. They understand pain, Grace replied simply. They've lived it too. James took a deep breath and descended the stairs. The conversations hushed as he entered the living room. Familiar faces turned toward him, Tom with his weathered features, Maria holding her daughter's college acceptance letter, the Reynolds with their infant son, and many others whose lives had intersected with his. For a long moment no one spoke. Then Tom stepped forward, his military posture straight despite his years. We heard what they're saying about you, he said gruffly. Wanted you to know it doesn't change a damn thing for us. Maria nodded. You gave us respect, Mr. Whitaker, not just jobs. The youngest Reynolds boy, about 7, broke from his mother's side and ran to James. Are you sad because of the mean people? My dad says they're just jealous. James knelt to the child's level, his throat tight. Maybe a little sad, he admitted. When I'm sad, Mom says to remember the good things. The boy offered seriously. James looked up at the circle of faces, people who had been homeless, hopeless, forgotten, now standing tall in his home, standing for him. The wall inside him crumbled completely. The group surrounding James in his living room wasn't just offering comfort, they were planning a revolution. We've started something, Tom announced, unfolding a tablet computer. Maria's daughter helped us put this together yesterday. He pressed play on a video. A weathered man in his 60s appeared on screen, standing proudly in front of a partially renovated building. My name is Frank Willis. I slept under Highway 27 for 8 years after losing my construction business. James Whitaker didn't just give me a job, he asked for my opinion on structural designs. First time in a decade, somebody looked me in the eye and saw a builder instead of a bum. The video cut to a young mother holding a toddler. I'm Darlene. This is Katie. We lived in my car until Mr. Whitaker's shelter opened. Now I manage their kitchen staff. My daughter has her own bed with pink sheets. More faces appeared, dozens of them, each with a name, a story, and a life transformed. James watched, speechless, as person after person spoke directly to the camera, their testimonials raw and unscripted. We posted it last night, Maria explained. It's been shared over 10,000 times already. That's not all, Tom added, nodding toward the window. James moved to look outside. What he saw made his knees weak. Lining the street outside the mansion gates were at least 100 people. Some held handmade signs. James gave me dignity, the truth about Whitaker, and simply, he gave us hope. Many were faces he recognized from the shelters and work programs. Others were strangers who'd been moved by their stories. They've been arriving since dawn, Grace said softly, coming to stand beside him. No one called them, they just came. As he watched, a local news van pulled up. A reporter approached the crowd cautiously, likely expecting angry protesters. Instead, a small elderly woman took the microphone. I'm Agnes Peterman, her voice projected through the outdoor speakers. I was a school teacher for 40 years before medical bills took everything. Mr. Whitaker didn't know me from Eve, but he found me sleeping in the park and asked what I needed most. She straightened her shoulders. I told him my dignity. Next day, I was helping coordinate educational programs at his downtown center. Those lies they're printing? Not the man I know. The crowd erupted in applause. Another person stepped forward. Then another. The reporter's expression shifted from skeptical to genuinely intrigued. "They're fighting for you," Grace whispered. James pressed his palm against the cool window glass. "I never asked them to." "That's exactly why they're doing it," Tom said, his voice gruff with emotion. "Real kindness doesn't ask for payback." By afternoon, the crowd had doubled. Other news stations arrived. Social media buzzed with hashtags, "The Real James Whitaker" and "Homeless to Hopeful." The very outlets that had published the smear stories began running pieces, questioning the sources of the allegations. One particularly touching video went viral, a 10-year-old boy showing his first ever bedroom in one of James's family shelters, proudly displaying his homework on a small desk. "Mr. James says I can be anything," he declared with absolute certainty. That evening, standing among the people who'd once been invisible to society, James felt something he hadn't experienced since the scandal broke strength. Not his alone, but the collective power of those who refused to let lies destroy what they knew to be true. The tide wasn't just turning, it was becoming a wave. The next morning, James stood in the grand foyer, staring at the massive oak doors that separated him from the world outside. The voices of reporters shouting questions mingled with the supportive chants of those who had gathered to defend him. "Are you sure about this?" Grace asked, smoothing a wrinkle from his simple blue button-down shirt. James nodded. "I've been hiding long enough." Tom handed him a glass of water. "We're right behind you, boss." James took a deep breath and squared his shoulders. For a moment, he remembered standing outside these same doors years ago, cold and desperate, while the Carters mocked him from within. How the world had changed. He pushed open the doors. Camera flashes exploded in his face. Microphones thrust forward like weapons. The shouted questions overlapped into a wall of noise. "Mr. Whitaker, did you fabricate your relationship with Samuel Whitaker? Were you ever addicted to drugs? How do you respond to allegations that—" James raised his hands, and remarkably, the crowd quieted. The silence felt heavy with expectation. He glanced back at Grace, who nodded encouragingly. "My name is James Whitaker," he began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. 3 years ago, I lost my teaching job, then my house, and finally my dignity. I slept under bridges, behind dumpsters, and yes, right here, outside these very gates." Cameras clicked frantically. James pointed to a spot on the driveway. "I stood there, in the rain, watching people enjoy what I'd lost. The family who lived here then threw trash at me and called me pathetic." The reporters scribbled notes, their expressions shifting from predatory to attentive. "I was nobody's cousin then, nobody's heir, just another invisible man." James paused, his voice growing stronger. "Then I received news that changed everything. Samuel Whitaker, a distant cousin I'd met only twice in my childhood, left his fortune to me, his only living relative." He pulled a yellowed photograph from his pocket, showing a young James with an older man beside a ranch fence. "This is us, 30 years ago. The lawyers verified our relationship through DNA. Every penny I have came legitimately, though I'm still amazed by it every day." A hush fell over the crowd. Even the most aggressive reporters seemed subdued. "I know what it's like to be mocked," James continued. "I was mocked when I was poor, and I am mocked now that I am rich. But the truth is, wealth means nothing unless it lifts others." From behind the press lines, someone began to applaud. Others joined in, first the homeless advocates, then bystanders, and finally, even a few reporters lowered their notepads to clap. Every shelter, every job program, every meal served, that's the real inheritance. Not the money, but what it can do. James's voice broke slightly. "I was homeless, not worthless. None of us are. And I'll spend every dollar proving that." The questions that followed were different, respectful, curious about his projects, interested in his vision. The hostile edge had disappeared. As the impromptu press conference wound down, a reporter who had written one of the harshest pieces approached James privately. "I got it wrong," she admitted quietly. "I'm sorry." James extended his hand. "There's room for second chances for everyone, even reporters." For the first time in weeks, James walked back into the mansion with his head high and his heart lighter. The truth had begun to prevail. 6 weeks after his public statement, James stood before the renovated downtown building, its fresh facade gleaming in the morning sunlight. A large banner hung across the entrance. "Whitaker Foundation Shelter. Everyone deserves dignity." The crowd that gathered for the opening ceremony stretched down the block, a mix of community members, volunteers, media, and those who would soon call this place home. "Never thought I'd see this day," whispered Marcus, a Vietnam veteran who'd spent 15 years on the streets before James hired him as the shelter's maintenance supervisor. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his new tie. Neither did I, James admitted, surveying the scene with quiet amazement. The shelter wasn't just beds and meals. The three-story building housed medical facilities, job training classrooms, counseling offices, and private family units. Sunny communal spaces filled with books and games offered dignity beyond survival. The rooftop garden Tom's special project provided both food and healing. "We're ready for you, Mr. Whitaker," called out Sarah, a former teacher who'd lost everything in a fire before joining the foundation staff. James approached the podium, the same reporters who had vilified him now positioning themselves for the best camera angles. The headline in that morning's paper sat folded in his pocket, "From Homeless to Hero, Whitaker's billion-dollar promise." "This building isn't just a shelter," James began, his voice clear and steady. "It's the first of 20 planned across the country. The Whitaker Foundation is committing $5 billion over the next decade to reimagine how we address homelessness in America." Applause rippled through the crowd. Camera flashes punctuated his words. "Every person deserves more than survival. They deserve revival of spirit, purpose, and community." James gestured toward the people standing behind him. "These aren't my employees. They're my teachers. They taught me that our lowest moments don't define us." The media representatives who had once chased him with accusations now captured every word of his speech, their expressions respectful, even admiring. Morning shows requested interviews about his innovative approach to homelessness. Financial publications analyzed the foundation's structure, calling it a new model of philanthropy. After cutting the ribbon, James walked through the shelter with Grace beside him, introducing reporters to staff members each with their own story of resilience. "This is Diane," James said, putting his arm around the shoulder of a gray-haired woman. "She was a nurse for 30 years before medical bills took everything. Now she runs our health clinic." The reporter nodded, jotting notes. "And what made you hire people who've experienced homelessness themselves? Who better understands the journey?" James replied. "They've lived both the problem and the solution." Later, as the crowd thinned, James found himself alone in the shelter's community room. He ran his hand along a bookshelf filled with donated volumes. "Your heart was always in the right place," Grace said, finding him there. "The money just gave it a louder voice." James smiled. "I keep wondering what Samuel saw in me, why he chose me for this. Perhaps he knew you'd do exactly this." Grace slipped her hand into his. "Not just write checks, but build something that lasts." Outside, the foundation's new logo, a simple bridge spanning from darkness to light, flew on flags beside the entrance. Inside, the first residents were already arriving, carrying what little they owned, their faces bright with something many had forgotten: hope. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, a familiar sedan pulled up to the Whitaker Foundation headquarters. James watched from his office window as Charles Carter stepped out, looking thinner and older than James remembered. Linda followed, her designer clothes replaced by a simple blouse and slacks. Their son Nathan, now in his early 20s, emerged last, shoulders hunched with obvious discomfort. James felt a strange twist in his gut. These people had thrown a soda can at him, had laughed as he stood shivering in the rain. Yet now they approached with the unmistakable posture of the desperate. "The Carters are here to see you," his assistant announced. "Should I tell them you're in a meeting?" James shook his head. "Send them in." The family that entered bore little resemblance to the arrogant neighbors who had mocked him years before. Charles had lost the swagger in his step. Linda's face showed lines of worry. Nathan wouldn't meet James's eyes. "Thank you for seeing us," Charles began, his voice thick. "I know we have no right to ask." "Please, sit down," James interrupted, gesturing to the chairs before his desk. Linda clutched her purse, knuckles white. "After we lost the house, Charles got sick. Cancer. The treatments." Her voice broke. "We've sold everything, but the bills keep coming. And Nathan had to drop out of college." James looked at Nathan, the boy who had thrown that soda can, now a young man with fear shadowing his eyes. "I'm working 2 jobs, Nathan said, finally looking up. "But it's not enough for Dad's treatments and the rent." James opened a drawer and pulled out a folder. "I've been keeping tabs on your family," he admitted. "Not out of malice, but because I wondered what happened to you." Charles hung his head. "We deserve whatever you think of us. The way we treated you." "I remember standing in your driveway," James said quietly, "soaking wet, asking if I could just warm up for a few minutes." Linda wiped away tears. "We were cruel, horrible. I've thought about that night 1,000 times." James stood and walked to the window. For years he'd imagined this moment the Carters humbled before him, begging for help. He'd pictured himself turning them away, letting them taste the bitter rejection they'd served him. Instead, he felt nothing but compassion. "I've already taken care of the medical bills," James said, turning back to face their stunned expressions. And I've arranged for Nathan to return to college with a full scholarship through the foundation. The silence in the room was broken only by Linda's soft sob. Why? Charles whispered. After what we did? Because forgiveness isn't just words, James replied. It's action. And holding on to bitterness only poisoned me, not you. Nathan stood abruptly, tears streaming down his face. I throw a can at you, and you pay for my college? The person I was angry at doesn't exist anymore, James said gently. I see that now. Just like the homeless man you mocked isn't who I am either. He walked around the desk and extended his hand to Charles. Your only obligation is to heal, then find someone else who needs the same grace you received today. Charles gripped James's hand with both of his. We don't deserve this. None of us deserve grace, James said. That's what makes it grace. As the Carters left, Nathan paused at the door. I want to volunteer here, he said quietly. If you'll have me. James nodded. Tomorrow, 9 o'clock. The door closed, and James stood alone, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. The garden behind the mansion glowed with tiny lights strung through the trees, reflecting off the small pond where koi fish drifted like living shadows. James stood near the stone bench, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. The evening breeze carried the scent of roses and jasmine, plants he'd never known by name until Grace had helped him restore the neglected gardens. He heard her footsteps on the gravel path before he saw her. Beautiful night, Grace said, coming to stand beside him. She wore a simple blue dress, her silver hair loose around her shoulders. I just checked on the dinner preparations for tomorrow's volunteer appreciation event. James nodded, suddenly finding his carefully rehearsed words tangled in his throat. They'd known each other for over 2 years now, from that first morning when she'd found him behind the grocery store to today, when she practically ran the foundation's community outreach programs. I saw Nathan Carter working in the office today, Grace said, filling his silence. That young man has changed so much. People can change, James managed. If they're given the chance, Grace smiled. And if they meet the right people along the way. The courage he'd been gathering all day finally solidified. James turned to face her directly. Grace, I need to tell you something. She tilted her head, moonlight catching the laugh lines around her eyes. Is everything all right? More than all right. He took a deep breath. When you found me that morning, I was at my lowest point. I'd given up. But you didn't see a homeless man, you saw a person who mattered. Because you did matter, James. You always have. And now. He reached for her hand, weathered and warm in his own. Now I have all this. The mansion, the foundation, a purpose. But none of it means anything without you beside me. Grace's eyes widened, her fingers tightening around his. I never thought I'd feel this way again after losing Sarah, he continued, his voice growing steadier. I thought that part of my life was over. But you've shown me that the heart can heal, can grow, can love again. James, Grace whispered, her cheeks flushing pink in the dim light. I'm not just grateful to you, Grace. I care deeply for you. The words flowed easier now. I love you. A small tear escaped down her cheek. I never thought. After Harold died, I believed that chapter of my life was finished. I poured everything into the soup kitchen, into helping others. I know, James said softly, but then this stubborn man came along, she continued with a watery smile, who refused to stay in the box I'd put him in, who kept showing up and asking questions and making me laugh when I least expected it. She reached up and touched his face gently. I love you too, James Whitaker. God help me, but I do. James felt something final and beautiful settle in his chest, a feeling of coming home after a long journey. He leaned forward and kissed her forehead softly. So what happens now? Grace asked, her hand still in his as they turned to watch the fireflies beginning to dance above the garden. Now, James said, we walk the next chapter together. Whatever it brings. They sat on the stone bench, hands intertwined, planning quietly under the canopy of stars. Not just for tomorrow's event or next month's foundation projects, but for a shared future neither had dared to imagine until this moment. The mansion gleamed in the morning sunlight as dozens of volunteers tied colorful ribbons across the grand entrance. A hand-painted banner stretched above the doorway. Whitaker Haven, where second chances begin. James adjusted his simple blue tie, standing at the top of the marble steps beside Grace, their fingers lightly intertwined. Are you ready? She whispered, squeezing his hand. I've been ready for this my whole life, James replied. I just didn't know it. The crowd gathered on the sprawling front lawn, reporters, community members, and most importantly, the families who would call this place home. Many of the faces belonged to people James had met during his own homeless days. people who had shared their last sandwich or offered a kind word when the world seemed darkest. James stepped forward to the microphone. His voice, once timid from years of being ignored, now carried across the grounds with quiet confidence. 2 years ago, I stood outside these gates in the rain. I was hungry, hopeless, and mocked by those who lived here. He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. Today, I stand before you not as the owner of this mansion, but as its caretaker. These walls were built to separate wealth from poverty. Today, we tear down that division. With a nod to Grace, he cut the ribbon. Applause erupted as the doors swung open wide. The east wing of the mansion had been transformed. What were once private bedrooms for occasional guests now housed 15 families. The formal dining room had become a community kitchen. The library remained filled with books, but now included computers for job searches and education. Children raced through the open doors, their laughter echoing off marble floors that had never known such joyful sounds. A little girl with braids stopped to spin in wonder beneath the crystal chandelier. "Is this really our home now, Mommy?" she asked, eyes wide. Her mother, a woman James recognized from the downtown shelter, nodded through tears. Outside, long tables had been set up across the same lawn where the Carter's son had once thrown a soda can at James. Now, families gathered around platters of food, passing dishes and sharing stories. A group of veterans men who had helped renovate the building and now worked as maintenance staff manned the grills, arguing good-naturedly about the proper way to flip burgers. James wandered through it all, occasionally stopping to shake a hand or receive a grateful hug. Near the rose garden, he paused, overwhelmed by the contrast between memory and present reality. "This was where I stood that night," he said quietly to Grace when she joined him, "soaking wet, watching the Carters' dinner party through the window." Grace slipped her arm through his. "And now look." From this vantage point, they could see children playing tag across the lawn, their shrieks of delight carrying on the summer breeze. Elderly residents sat in the shade of oak trees, watching with smiling eyes. A young man once addicted and homeless now taught a group of children how to plant seedlings in the vegetable garden. "It's not just shelter they're finding here," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's dignity, purpose. It's healing," Grace finished softly. James nodded, unable to speak as joy welled up inside him. The mansion, once a monument to wealth and exclusion, had transformed into something far more valuable. A place of belonging, of second chances, of hearts made whole again. The house itself seemed to breathe with new life, as if it too had found its true purpose at last. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the mansion grounds, the crowd gathered in the courtyard. Lanterns flickered to life in the growing dusk, their warm glow reflecting in the fountain that now stood where there had once been an ostentatious statue of the previous owners. James stood at a simple wooden podium, watching faces both familiar and new settle into chairs arranged in concentric circles. His journey had come full circle too, from teacher to homeless man to reluctant millionaire to something else entirely, a steward of hope. "When I was a teacher," James began, his voice steady and clear, "I used to tell my students that our value isn't measured by what we have, but by what we give." He paused, looking around at the transformed mansion. "I forgot that lesson when I lost everything. I measured myself by my emptiness, my lack, my losses." A gentle breeze rustled through the courtyard, carrying the scent of jasmine from the newly planted gardens where homeless veterans now worked as landscapers. "Then came this inheritance, more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. And for a moment, I measured myself by that too." James smiled, remembering his initial shock. "But standing here today, I realized the true inheritance wasn't the money at all." Behind him, a string quartet made up of formerly homeless musicians began to play softly. The melody wove through his words, lifting them. "The greatest inheritance is not money. It is hope, love, and second chances." His voice caught slightly. "It's the courage I learned from each of you. The dignity that can never be taken away, only forgotten for a while." In the front row, an elderly man who'd once shared his cardboard box with James during a winter storm nodded, tears tracking down his weathered face. "Every person who finds shelter here, every child who plays without fear, every veteran who stands tall again, you are the real wealth. You are the inheritance I pass on." James gestured to the mansion behind him. "These walls don't belong to me. They belong to all of us who know what it means to fall and rise again." The music swelled, lifting into the twilight. Grace stepped forward to stand beside him, her hand finding his. Her fingers tightened around his as their eyes met, a lifetime of understanding passing between them. Around them, children darted between chairs, chasing fireflies that had begun to rise from the gardens. Their laughter punctuated the music like the brightest notes in a beautiful composition. James felt tears well in his eyes, but he didn't try to hide them. These weren't tears of shame or bitterness, they were tears of profound gratitude. From the depths of despair beneath a bridge to this moment of complete fulfillment, his path had been neither straight nor easy. Yet every painful step had led him here. As he looked out at the faces illuminated by lantern light, faces that had known hunger and hardship, but now shone with dignity and purpose, James knew with absolute certainty that his legacy would never be measured in dollars. The 850 million had been merely a tool, a means to something far more valuable. His true legacy was compassion made visible hope, with a heartbeat love with open doors. And it would outlast any fortune. If you enjoyed the story, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.